It was supposed to be a simple date. That's what I kept telling myself as I got ready that evening. A casual dinner with someone I met online, nothing too serious, just a way to pass the time. But it turned into something darker, something twisted that I could never have imagined. Her name was Lila. We'd been talking for weeks, swapping stories and laughter. She was witty, charming, and always seemed to know just what to say. Her smile could light up a room, or so I thought when I saw her profile picture. We exchanged messages about everything: books, movies, travel, and life. It felt natural, like we had known each other for years. Finally, we decided to meet at a small, quaint restaurant tucked away on the outskirts of town. It was one of those hidden gems, a place with a cozy, intimate vibe that everyone swore had the best food in the area. The kind of place where time seemed to slow down, where people came to forget the world outside. It sounded perfect, like the ideal setting for a first date. When I arrived, I saw her immediately. She was sitting at a corner table, looking just as I imagined she would. Beautiful, confident, and effortlessly alluring. Her brown hair framed her face perfectly, and her eyes gleamed with excitement as she noticed me approaching. A rush of warmth washed over me. This could be the beginning of something special. "Hi," she greeted me, standing up to give me a quick hug. She smelled of lavender and vanilla. "I'm so glad you came." I sat down, and we dove right into conversation. The evening started off wonderfully. We shared our favorite memories, laughed at each other's jokes, and got lost in stories that made the world feel like it was ours alone. But as the night wore on, something started to feel off. It was subtle at first. Lila would glance over her shoulder as though checking for something or someone in the darkened corners of the room. Every time I asked her what she was looking at, she'd just smile, her eyes flickering nervously. "Oh, nothing," she'd say with a dismissive wave. "I guess I'm just tired. Long day at work." But I could sense it. Something was wrong. The restaurant itself, normally so inviting, began to feel strange. The air grew thick, like it was weighed down by something unseen. The overhead lights flickered briefly before returning to normal. But when I looked around, no one else seemed to notice. Everyone continued their conversations, their laughter filling the room. The temperature dropped slightly, and the glass of water in front of me began to condense with moisture. Even though the room had been warm, I pushed the unease aside. Maybe it was just my nerves. But then, a moment came that I couldn't ignore. The waiter arrived with our food. He placed a plate in front of me, but as he turned to leave, he paused, staring at Lila for a long, unsettling moment. His expression shifted from pleasant to something colder. Then, in a voice so low that I barely heard him, he said, "She'll be expecting you too." Lila's face remained neutral, but I saw a brief flicker of something else in her eyes. Something darker, almost predatory. The waiter left without another word. I turned to Lila, unsure of what had just happened. "What was that about?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She laughed lightly, but there was a strain in her voice. "Oh, just one of those weird things waiters say, right?" She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Let's not let it ruin our evening." But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch further than they should have, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. But no one seemed to notice. No one seemed to feel what I felt. Then, without warning, Lila reached across the table, her hand cold as ice. She took mine, her grip firm and unyielding. Her touch sent a shiver down my spine. I looked up into her eyes. Her pupils had dilated, her gaze intense and unfocused. "You're not like the others," she said in a voice that sent a chill through me. "I can feel it." I pulled my hand away, my heart pounding. "What are you talking about?" Lila's smile faltered for just a second, and when she spoke again, her voice sounded almost like a whisper, like she was speaking to herself. "You belong here, with me." A wave of nausea hit me. The temperature in the room seemed to drop even further. I felt trapped. The walls of the restaurant seemed to close in around me, and the noise of the other diners faded away, leaving only the sound of my racing heartbeat. Lila's eyes darted again, But this time, I followed her gaze. There, standing in the far corner of the restaurant, was a figure. A tall man, his face obscured in shadows. He didn't move, just stood there watching us. But when I looked back at Lila, she was no longer smiling. Her face was tight, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I need to go," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm sorry, but this is too much." Lila didn't respond right away. Instead, she stood up and stepped closer, her breath cold against my skin. "You can't leave," she said softly. "Not yet. Not until you understand." The lights flickered again, this time plunging the restaurant into complete darkness. I tried to stand, to make a break for the door, but the air felt heavy, oppressive. A whisper, cold and distant, filled the space around me. My skin crawled. I heard Lila's voice in my ear, low and guttural, as though it were coming from somewhere deep inside her. "You were always meant to be here, with us." The lights flickered back on, and when they did, Lila was standing right in front of me. Her smile was no longer warm. It was monstrous, her lips stretched impossibly wide. But that wasn't what terrified me the most. What scared me was her eyes, black as night, empty voids that seemed to suck in all light, all hope. "Help," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Lila's laugh echoed around me, hollow and mocking. She grabbed me by the shoulders, her grip unyielding, her fingers ice cold. "There's no escaping now," she hissed. I could feel it then, the presence of something more, something ancient and terrifying. The walls of the restaurant seemed to close in, the shadows bending and twisting, and for a moment I thought I heard whispers in a language I couldn't understand. Before I could react, I was pulled into the darkness. A feeling of weightlessness overtook me, as though I were falling. The last thing I saw was Lila's face, inches from mine, her eyes empty and hungry. I woke up the next morning, gasping for breath. My body was cold, my hands trembling. I was back in my apartment, lying on the floor as if I had been there for hours. My phone buzzed on the table next to me. I grabbed it, desperate for any sign that the nightmare was over. One message appeared on the screen, from an unknown number. I opened it. "You will never leave. You belong to me." I tried to delete it, but the message wouldn't disappear. It lingered on my screen, a permanent scar. A warning. And that's when I understood. The date wasn't just a date. It was a trap. I had been chosen, pulled into something far darker than I could have imagined. The worst part? I knew that sooner or later I'd have to meet her again. And the next time, I wouldn't be able to escape. It all started on a Friday evening. I'd been meaning to get away for a while, so I rented a cabin deep in the woods. Just me, the fresh air, and a week without constant notifications. The listing had stellar reviews, cozy, secluded, and with just enough modern amenities to stay comfortable. When I arrived, it was everything I'd hoped for. The cabin was nestled at the edge of a sprawling forest, surrounded by towering pines that whispered with the wind. Inside, there was a small fireplace, rustic wooden furniture, and a view from the back porch that made you feel like you were staring into eternity. It felt like the perfect escape. But things didn't stay perfect for long. I was unpacking my bags when I heard the first knock at the door. It startled me because the cabin was miles away from the nearest town. I hadn't seen a single car or person on the winding dirt road that led here. Cautiously, I opened the door, and there she was. A woman in her mid-30s, drenched from the rain that had started falling. Her dark hair clung to her face, and her clothes were soaked through. She looked relieved to see me. "Hi," she said, shivering. "Sorry to bother you. My car broke down just a mile up the road, and my phone, it's dead. Can I come in for a moment?" Her voice was soft but strained, like she was trying to hold it together. I hesitated. Every survival instinct told me not to let a stranger into the cabin. But she looked genuinely distressed. And what kind of person turns someone away in the middle of a storm? "Of course," I said, stepping aside. She introduced herself as Mara and thanked me profusely for letting her in. I offered her a towel, some tea, and a seat by the fire. As she warmed up, she explained that she'd been driving to visit a friend when her car suddenly stalled. She'd been walking for nearly an hour before finding the cabin. "I'll call a tow truck first thing in the morning," she said, sipping her tea. "If it's not too much trouble, could I stay here tonight? Just until the storm passes?" I hesitated again, but eventually agreed. "Sure. There's a couch over there." She smiled, but something about her expression didn't feel right. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it lingered a moment too long, like she was sizing me up. The night passed uneventfully, though I didn't sleep well. Something about Mara put me on edge. Maybe it was the way she moved around the cabin, her footsteps too quiet, or the way her eyes would dart toward me when she thought I wasn't looking. Still, I told myself I was just being paranoid. The next morning, the storm had cleared, but Mara didn't seem in a hurry to leave. She'd made herself at home, fixing breakfast and chatting as if we were old friends. When I asked if she needed help with her car, she waved it off. "Oh, I'll take care of it later," she said. "It's such a nice place here. I don't want to leave just yet." That's when I started to feel trapped. By the second day, it was clear something was wrong. Mara hadn't left to check on her car. In fact, she barely stepped outside. Every time I brought it up, she'd change the subject. When I hinted that she should call for a tow truck, she gave me a strange smile and said, "Oh, there's no rush. You don't mind the company, do you?" I did mind. The cabin was supposed to be my escape, my time to recharge. But now I couldn't even relax in my own space. Worse, I started noticing things that didn't add up. Her clothes, for example. They were still damp on the first night, but by the second day, they looked completely dry, like they'd never been wet at all. And her phone, the one she said was dead, I'd caught her holding it in the kitchen, the screen glowing faintly before she quickly stuffed it in her pocket. That night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just Mara moving around the cabin, but the sound wasn't coming from inside. It was outside, circling the perimeter. Slow, deliberate steps crunching on the gravel and leaves. I stayed in bed, heart pounding, listening as the footsteps stopped right outside my window. The curtains were drawn, but I could feel someone, or something, standing there, watching me. Then, just as suddenly as they'd started, the footsteps moved away. The next morning I confronted Mara. "Did you hear anything last night?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked at me with wide, innocent eyes. "No, I slept like a baby." "Why?" I didn't believe her. That evening, I decided to check on her story. I told Mara I was going for a walk, but instead I went to look for her car. If she'd really broken down, it couldn't be far. I found it about half a mile up the road, just as she'd said. But something was wrong. The car wasn't stalled, it had been deliberately wrecked. The front bumper was smashed against a tree, and all 4 tires had been slashed. Inside, the seats were ripped, and the dashboard was covered in strange, jagged scratches, as if an animal had clawed at it. But what really sent chills down my spine was what I found in the trunk. A small leather bag filled with photographs. All of them were of me, at my house, at work, even here at the cabin. Some of them had been taken from inside. I ran back to the cabin, my mind racing. When I got there, Mara was sitting on the couch, smiling like she'd been waiting for me. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked, her voice calm and sweet. I froze. My throat was dry. "What is this? Who are you?" She stood up slowly, her smile never fading. "You invited me in, remember? That's all I needed." The lights flickered and the air in the room seemed to shift. It felt heavier, colder. Mara's features began to blur, her eyes darkening until they were nothing but hollow voids. I don't remember much after that. I woke up the next morning on the floor, the cabin eerily quiet. Mara was gone, but her presence lingered. The photos from her bag were scattered across the living room, and the door was wide open, letting in the crisp morning air. I packed my things and left as quickly as I could. When I reported the incident to the local police, they said no one named Mara had been in the area, and no cars matching her description had been found. But every now and then, late at night, I hear footsteps outside my window. Slow, deliberate steps, like someone circling, waiting for an invitation to come back in.